Okay, third lecture in stress and addiction, and we are really talking about the human body when we talk about stress and we talk about addiction. And so there's two main types of organ systems that I want to talk about. We've already talked about the nervous system and touch on the role in our mood and a lot of different things. Next lecture is really about the role of the nervous system in addiction. Today we're going to talk about the other major system that coordinates all the cells of your body, and that is through chemical means. The nervous system is largely through electrical signals, and then here we're going to talk about the endocrine system, which is really a chemical system that in its job is to coordinate and control the body so that all these myriad of different tissue types are working together to do everything that the body needs to do. Okay. Endocrine system made up of these various glands that we'll look at the pictures of these glands, tissues that are throughout the body that are basically secrete hormones, and then the hormones themselves. Okay, the endocrine cells in these glands produce the hormones. The hormones flow through the blood and reach their target cell. So, nervous signals travel very fast, but they don't last a long time. Okay, so some type of reactions require an electrical impulse and a response from the nervous system. But then there are other types of reactions that happen in our body. They don't need to happen as quickly, but they need to last a little bit longer than the action potential in a nerve cell. Okay, and those kind of responses are mediated largely by the endocrine system. So here's some of those glands that are involved with the endocrine system. Okay, a couple of important parts of the brain: the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, found there in underneath the cerebrum, above the brain stem. The thyroid gland is very involved with metabolism. So you hear people that have thyroid issues maybe are too thin or too heavy, depending on how much hormone is produced by the thyroid gland. Then two important ones around the kidney. One is the pancreas, and then the other sits atop the kidney. These are called adrenal glands. And then, of course, don't forget the testes and the ovaries, and these produce the sex hormones, both testosterone and estrogen. Okay, these are very important in mood and confidence and muscle tone and aggression. A lot of behavioral traits are controlled by these sex hormones. So the gland, in this case the adrenal gland, produces the hormone. So this cell is just like the cells we talked about in Cancer Theme, animal cells, ribosomes and Golgi apparatus, the endoplasmic reticulum that are generating lipids, generating proteins. Those things are dumped out through a duct, usually into a blood vessel, travel through the blood vessel, and are received by a specific target cell. So how do you know if a hormone is going to target a given cell? Well, it depends on if their specific receptor is on that cell for that specific hormone. So in that way, it's like the neurotransmitter situation we talked about in the nervous system. Okay, so hormone acts on a given cell type if it has the receptor. Okay, so you can have receptor cells on a bunch of different tissue types. Right? There may be one in the liver, and there may be a receptor on the muscle cell, and they can have the same hormone, and in that regard affect multiple different tissue types and therefore have multiple effects in the body. Okay, so this is sort of a classic, very generic hormone. Again, once you get in the bloodstream, anywhere is possible in the body because all cells need oxygen and glucose, and so the blood produces those. So hormones are in this way, it's very handy, and it can reach all parts of the body. Where can the nervous system work is if the nerve fibers move out to that specific area of the body, and therefore to be under nervous control. Let's see, this already said, same hormone can have different effects in different organs. And we can break up, there's a bunch of different hormones. We're going to talk about just relatively few of them. But in general, you can sort of categorize a hormone depending on whether it's what we call lipid soluble or water soluble. And so let's look at those two types of hormone pathways. Okay, so here's a given cell. We've talked about cells. Really, if you're looking at living things, you've got to understand cells. On the outside of every cell type is this plasma membrane, which is this lipid bilayer. It's probably about the same consistency and really very similar makeup as olive oil. So this is a fatty membrane around the outside of the cell. So water-soluble hormones are not dissolvable in lipids. They're not dissolvable in the plasma membrane. They cannot move through the plasma membrane. So if that hormone is going to have an effect on a given cell, then there needs to be a receptor on the outside of the plasma membrane. So here's the action of the hormone. Received, number 2, causes this cascade of intermediate relay molecules. Right? So this maybe changes the shape of that, which produces this, which affects this. This is called the signal transduction pathway. And then at the end, the actual action that these relay molecules have on a cell is either something that happens out in the cytoplasm, might affect directly ribosome, something like that, but more commonly the end effect of reception of a hormone is that the genes inside of the nucleus are regulated. So we know genes are just simply information molecules for ribosomes, and ribosomes make proteins, and proteins are what make the cell do what the cell does. Okay? So if you change the way that, you don't change the actual sequence, A's and T's and C's and G's on the gene, you change the way that that gene is transcribed and translated. You change whether or not it is transcribed and translated. You change the timing of these kind of things, right? And so that gene regulation is a very powerful effect that ultimately happens because the hormone was received here. These are the water soluble. Again, think about oil and water. They don't mix, so therefore the receptors on the outside. Now, if the membrane is crossable by the hormone, that is, if the hormone can be dissolved in lipids, if it's lipid soluble, boop, it goes right through the plasma membrane. Okay. Now, we haven't had an effect on the cell yet because what is always needed in a given cell type is that actual receptor. Okay, and we see this is a lock and key situation. It is a three-dimensional fit. The hormone has to fit into the shape of the receptor in order to have an effect on that cell. The key difference here being that the receptor is inside of the plasma membrane. Okay, once the hormone and the receptor come together, it forms this complex. That hormone receptor complex moves into the nucleus, and guess what happens? Yup, gene regulation. Okay, so in the end, the effect of a hormone is to alter the production of proteins. And those proteins, again, it can be signals themselves, they can be growth hormones, they can be enzymes, they can be motor proteins. Anything that work related that a cell does, it can be affected by gene regulation, therefore by hormones. Okay, so let's look at sort of a classic example of the, trying to find a place for this, shoot. Classic example of the action of the endocrine system. Okay, and this is the an example of homeostasis, which is basically maintaining acceptable and relatively stable levels. In this case, we're talking about blood sugar, but other things that are maintained at a relatively stable level are body temperature, right? We know when you get too warm, you sweat. When you get too cold, you shiver. All these different cycles where we fluctuate around an acceptable level. So the organs that are involved here is the pancreas and the liver, and the hormones that are involved are glucagon and insulin. Okay, and so we'll look at this figure. It's much easier to just actually read or look at the diagram than it is to explain this in words. Okay, 25.10, very important diagram here. Okay, if you can understand this diagram, if you can explain this to somebody, if you can walk through step by step, then you know the material. If you can't, then you don't know the material, right? If you've looked at this and you've read it 100 times, it really doesn't matter. That's not learning, right? Learning is trying to process through it and verbalizing it, drawing it, redrawing it. If you can sit down and redraw this and explain it, you're in good shape. Okay, so this is a cycle. There's no real start or stop. This is going on inside of your body all the time. But we'll just arbitrarily start here at 1. And so say you just have some juice, you eat a bowl of ice cream, whatever it is. Actually, it doesn't have to be pure sugar. It could be a bowl of spaghetti. Right? Your body starts to break those starches down. Really, and the starch is broken down. It's made up of a lot of glucose molecules. So once your body releases those glucose molecules, they go into the blood through your intestine, absorbed after they're digested into the blood, and then this will rise. It will raise the level of glucose. So your blood sugar level goes up. Okay, so when your blood sugar level goes up, the response is that it needs to come down, because if you maintain high levels of blood sugar for too long, then you basically can damage your kidneys and all of your organs. So high blood sugar glucose is a dangerous thing. So the pancreas produces the hormone insulin. Insulin flows through the blood. There are receptors in your fat cells, the receptors in your muscle cells, but probably the bigger place where this happens is in the liver. Okay, so the liver has the receptors, and when insulin is received, then what happens is that glucose is taken out of the blood and it is locked up as this larger molecule called glycogen. So glycogen is sort of like, the analogy I think of as like a big brick house, and the individual bricks are glucose. So glycogen is made up of glucose. And so when glucose is locked up in the glycogen in your liver, hey Skippy, come here. Come here, big boy. Come here. Skippy, come here. Come here. This is my Skippy dog. You say hi, Skippy? Oh, smell like piss. So the point is to lower glucose levels, okay? So if it's locked up in glycogen, it's not flowing around in the blood. Now, too much insulin, glucose level drops. Low glucose level is dangerous too, right? It can actually go into a coma if your blood sugar gets too low. So there's a alternative pathway. When blood sugar gets too low, then the pancreas produces a second and different hormone called glucagon, which is taken up by the liver, and then the liver, guess what it does? It takes that glycogen and starts to break it down into glucose. The glucose goes into the blood, rises your blood sugar, insulin's produced, locked into glycogen, glucose goes down. Glucagon produced, glycogen is released as glucose, and so on and so forth, right? So you get this sort of, I call it antagonistic hormones. Insulin causes a lowering in blood glucose. Glucagon produces an increase in blood glucose. Okay. So, to me, kind of the interesting part of this is what happens when something goes wrong, and that is what we call insulin, or diabetes. Okay. So the way that you know if you have diabetes is if you test your fasting blood sugar and it's too high consistently, then that tells you that you could be diabetic. Okay? And there's two types of diabetic. So thinking back to our diagram, 2510, okay, what is the root cause of having too much blood sugar? What is it? What's the hormone that lowers blood sugar? And that basically, if it's not there, then you have high blood sugar, you have diabetes, insulin. So type 1 diabetes is you are born with a genetic defect or genetic variation that does not allow your body to produce insulin. Okay, that is called insulin-dependent diabetes. Have this at birth. On the other hand, if you consistently are not taking good care of your body, eating crappy food, and your blood sugar stays too high, and your body is basically, what happens is your your liver gets worn out. Those receptors on the liver get worn out, and so insulin does not have the same effect as it used to, and so you maintain a higher blood sugar than you should. That's called type 2 diabetes. Then there is a third type. You'll probably have heard of folks, women, developing what's called preeclampsia, and oftentimes late in the gestational period. So late in their pregnancy, they can develop what's called gestational diabetes. Okay. So certainly the most common type of diabetes is type 2 diabetes. Okay. Very common, unfortunately. Okay, check out this. Oh yeah, here's a insulin pump. What's an insulin pump? It's basically like a artificial pancreas, which if your pancreas is not producing insulin, this pump senses when your blood sugar gets too high, sends a signal to the pump to inject a little bit of insulin into your bloodstream, which will bring down your blood glucose levels. Okay, look at this figure for a minute. Okay, what do you see? What's the story told by the information in this? Okay, a couple things. Actually, there's several stories here. One is, and what is hypoglycemia? Hyperthermia is when you're too hot. Hypoglycemia or hypothermia is when you're too cold. Hypoglycemia is when your blood sugar gets too low. And again, this can be very dangerous. So who's more likely to be admitted to the hospital for low blood sugar? We see obviously poor people. Okay, that's for a host of reasons, and largely it's a dietary type thing. If you eat low quality processed carbohydrates, things like potato chips, soda pop, ice cream, white bread, these things, when you eat them, your blood sugar spikes very high, produce a lot of insulin, blood sugar comes down too low, that can result in hypoglycemia. So diet is definitely an issue, which results in more people that are of low income ending up in the emergency room. What else is we see in the story? We have a aspect of time on here. So the beginning of the month, Roxy. The end of the month. And the beginning of the month, we see still a discrepancy, but the number of low-income people admitted to the hospital for low blood sugar increases throughout time because they have even less money at the beginning the end of the month than they did at the beginning of the month. And so they're probably maybe not eating as much as they should, or eating very low quality food. Pay attention. You go to the grocery store, and if you really wanted to eat well, you'd find that it's expensive to do so. Okay, so finally getting to stress. And this stress is really a combination of the nervous and the endocrine system. And hormone-wise, endocrine response-wise, there's two main types of stress responses. There's short-term, which happens quickly, can be activated in seconds, and will last for minutes or hours. So it's relatively short-term. This is fight or flight, okay, produced by adrenaline, also known as epinephrine. So epinephrine and norepinephrine, these are the actual hormones that are involved with the short-term stress response. And they are secreted by these part of the adrenal gland called the adrenal medulla. Okay, adrenal gland is broken into two parts: the medulla, which is on the inside, the center, and then the cortex, which is on the outside. Just like the cerebral cortex is that outer covering of the cerebrum of the brain, then the adrenal cortex is the covering of the adrenal gland. So here it is. Here's your kidney. Right, kidney is removing waste from digestion, and it is putting it into the urine. Right, through this duct, goes down to your bladder, and then out through the urethra. Okay. Atop of the kidney is this adrenal gland. Cut it in cross section. You see the cortex and the medulla. Okay. So again, stress response, short-term stress response. Some kind of stressful stimulus. This time of year, you think of horror movies and haunted houses, screaming, some loud noise, something that is frightful, will send a signal to your brain. It activates nerve impulses, so it starts an action potential in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus sends an electrical, probably through some neurotransmitter, sends a nerve impulse down through the central and peripheral nervous system out to the adrenal medulla, which then secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine, which go into the bloodstream, and we'll see the response. Again, epinephrine, I'm not sure, I remember talking about this before, I can't remember in what context, but this again is related to, in the addiction case study. Right? EpiPens is basically an injection of adrenaline. Okay, here it is in pictures. Response, stimulus, action potential sent from the hypothalamus down through the spinal cord, out the peripheral nervous system to the adrenal gland, secretion of epinephrine. Okay, goes into the blood. Where is it received? Well, there's numerous places that the numerous organs where the short-term stress response is felt, and we see that includes the organs we've been talking about with the glucose homeostasis. So the liver and the pancreas must have some receptors, and then also respiratory and circulatory system, right? But in the end, what happens is in the liver, that large storage molecule. So glycogen is like starch, like a starchy potato. And what is the potato? The plant doesn't grow potato for us. It grows it as it's like a piggy bank. When it makes a bunch of individual glucose molecules, it sends it down and stores it in the roots. When we have too much glucose in our blood and we want to put it in the piggy bank, we send it to the liver and we make a big glycogen molecule. So now we need to withdraw from the piggy bank. So adrenaline is received by the liver. The liver breaks some of those small glucose molecules off, sends them out to the blood. Concurrently, the heart beats more quickly, the veins and arteries constrict so that you have more pressure, makes the blood move faster. Also, your breathing rate increases, and also the pattern within which the blood flows in your body changes. So by enlarging some blood vessels and constricting some, the body can determine whether your blood goes to your rest and digest part of your body, that is to your intestines, or whether the blood goes out to your large muscle mass and your heart and things like that. So the whole point of this, and you think, oh, this, at first it doesn't really make sense why the body would do this. If you are experiencing stress and you need a burst of energy, right, what does that energy require? It requires glucose and oxygen, just like we talked about in the pollinator theme when we talked about mitochondria. Okay, all these connections, you should start seeing some connections in this class. And so the blood flows faster, it contains more oxygen, it contains more glucose. Your muscles are capable of a burst of energy without going into fermentation. Okay, so that's the short-term stress response. Very adaptive, and it has allowed animals to respond to their environment and survive. Long-term stress response, not surprisingly, involves different hormones, and these hormones result in a slower but longer lasting response in the body. Okay, so this, rather than lasting minutes, this is lasting for hours or even days. And those hormones are listed here. They're called corticosteroids, and one of the most important ones is cortisol. Okay, so yeah, we'll talk about what cortisol does, but pathway here, some stimulus, like, then you can fill in the blank with a stimulus. This may be, like right now I'm thinking about writing a eulogy for a funeral this weekend. It's stressing me out constantly in the back of your head. COVID, exams, graduation, getting a job, grad school, applications, all these things are psychological stimuli, right? They send a message to the hypothalamus, which releases a hormone. The hormone travels to another part of the brain called the pituitary, which secretes a second hormone called adrenocorticotropic hormones, ACTH, which flow through the blood. You can see why this takes longer, right? It's a slower response. Those hormones flow through the blood, are received by the outside of the adrenal gland, which then produce our actual stress hormones, corticosteroids. Okay, so stimulus, this green part is that inside part of the brain, produces releasing hormone, received by the pituitary, produces adrenocorticotropic hormones, which flow through the blood down to the adrenal gland, and the cortex produces these corticosteroids. These are common things, corticosteroids. So if you may get injections of cortisone for back pain, you might get injections of cortisone for really severe reaction to poison ivy, right? And so let's see, what is the impact of a corticosteroid? We need more energy to deal with whatever this existential threat is. So, of course, we're going to need more blood glucose. The difference here is, where does the blood glucose come from? Rather than breaking down our glycogen in the liver, the body actually starts to break down proteins and fats and turning them into glucose molecules. Okay, but in the end, it is an increase in blood glucose. And there's also immunosuppression that takes place. as a result of these long-term stress hormones. Why would that be adaptive, right? I think that it's related to definitely, well, I know it's related to inflammation somehow, right? Because we know inflammation is right, stuffy nose, watery eyes, itchy skin, that hot feeling around a cut. It's all inflammatory responses. But inflammation can also cause things like rheumatoid arthritis, can cause joint pain. And so if you need to be spurred into long-term action, then it's often helpful to have a little bit of, cutting down on the inflammation, which is associated with immunosuppression. Okay, so that's what the effect of the long-term stress response is. Figure 25.13, again, if you can explain this in detail, you understand the stress response. If you can't, well, you won't do particularly well in next week's test, right? So spend some time with this. I've already explained it. This just brings it all together in one house. Kind of parting slide here. A very important one to think about, and that is we all live in a very stressful world. You're going to be experiencing in a given day short-term stress response on top of long-term stress, and this is really damaging on your body. We'll talk in the next lecture about how these stress responses are actually very directly related to addiction. We could talk about how stress responses relate to your metabolism and how you take a given meal and whether you turn it into fat or whether you turn it into muscle. Stress response is related to how many infections you get because of this long-term immunosuppression. Stress is related to just so much of our physical health and our mental health, and our behaviors are related to these stress hormones. So what do we do acknowledging that? What are some ways to reduce stress? And there's some obvious things. Probably the most obvious and easiest to do is to sleep, right? And while you're sleeping, your body removes those stress hormones. Even just a quick nap, but really you need this uninterrupted, dark place, sleeping for 8-9 hours, exercise, meditation, right? But this is kind of a neat one. This group from business school showed that if you carry yourself properly and you have good posture, it's called power posing, you pull your shoulders back, try to maintain straight neck, even when you're sitting, right? It's about displaying some illusion of being alpha male, alpha female, and being a powerful person that actually will reduce those stress hormones and increases in the sex hormone testosterone. Okay, so these are just subtle little things that you can do throughout the day. Your breathing, posture, your diet, all those things can result in a decrease in stress hormones. So again, I think the overarching theme in this module has been the physical, biological side of these psychological things. These feelings, emotions, these behaviors have a physical and biological aspect, right? So I think it's good to learn those. All right, well, I'll see you in just a couple minutes for lecture 4.